I'm, for a little variety at this meeting, I am not giving one of my more academic papers. Instead, I'm talking about U.S.-China relations and U.S. policy toward China. That's because Americans are right now engaged in a pretty intense debate over U.S. policy toward China. And I'm really grateful to Yuan Li and to the CEA for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to get some feedback from our European and Chinese friends about the current state of U.S.-China relations and how we can preserve a constructive and cooperative relationship between these two very important countries. So thank you very much. People like me who've been studying China for most of my life and working hard to cement good relations between the U.S. and China are actually very concerned now. Relations between the two countries are more competitive and tense than when I served in the Clinton administration in 1997 to 2000. The tension is particularly acute in the Asian regional arena. Our planes and ships are rubbing up against one another in the South China Sea with the risk of inadvertent military escalation. We see Asia splitting into two blocks. The United States and its allies, Japan, South Korea, etc., on one side, and along with our newer friends like Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and then China, Russia, North Korea, Cambodia, Laos. And I know from years of listening to Chinese colleagues in government and outside of government talk about the goals for Chinese foreign policy in Asia, that one very important goal was to prevent the creation of anything like Cold War blocs of the region. And yet we see these blocs emerging. Back in the 1990s, there was really only one circumstance we could imagine a military confrontation between the U.S. and China, namely in the Taiwan Strait. But now there are four, including the South China Sea, conflict between China and Japan over whatever, or the East China Sea, or the violent collapse of North Korea. And the other thing we see is that both sides, particularly the Chinese side, but not only the Chinese side, emphasizing the differences in the political values and systems of the two countries. We used to say, I've said this a zillion times in my speeches, that the relationship between the U.S. and China, I'm very optimistic because it's not like U.S.-Soviet relations during the Cold War. We're not engaged in some global contest for ideological dominance. But you can't say that anymore. In China, President Xi Jinping, is emphasizing the risk of Western subversion against China, arguing that the United States in particular, including not just government, but universities, civil society organizations, are trying to subvert Communist Party rule through Western values and civil society organizations. And then on the U.S. side, generally President Obama has restrained from any similar kind of rhetoric, but in the effort to sell the Trans-Pacific Partnership politically, he did fall back on a statement about, do Asians want to be governed by American rules or Chinese rules? Framing this as a competition between two different sets of values and rules. So no wonder that public opinion in the two countries is growing more negative toward one another. So over the past year, I have been the co-chair of a bipartisan task force of China experts from the policy community and from universities to reassess previous U.S.-China policy to see how well it's worked, what hasn't worked, and to talk about how we might need to modify our strategy to make it more effective in the future. And basically, my own motivation was I was personally confused in my own mind. I didn't really know what I thought. So what I did with my colleague Orville Schell at Asia Society is invite the people whom I most respect in the field to help me clarify my own thinking. I wanted to hear what they had to say and engage in discussion with them. So I want to share some of that debate with you today and get your feedback. Before about 2009, American and Chinese foreign policy makers, I think, could congratulate themselves on how well we were managing U.S.-China relations. And this is a very difficult thing to do, to manage a relationship between a rising power and the incumbent power. History teaches us that what they call these power transition periods almost always lead to military conflict, and that the cause of that conflict is as much the misperceptions of the incumbent power as it is the aggressive behavior of the rising power. And to add to the challenge, the U.S. and China have two very different kinds of political systems. And yet the two countries were managing to get along. And why was that? So now we're looking back. Why did it work pretty well? I think the credit goes to both U.S. engagement policy toward China and China's own strategy of reassurance, China's reassurance strategy toward the United States and toward other countries, especially its own neighbors. So let me talk about both of those. U.S. engagement policy. Ever since President Nixon went to China in 1972, we have had 8 presidential administrations, Democrat, Republican alike, that basically adopted the same strategy toward China. Our shorthand is engagement. Basically, they tried to work diplomatically with China to build a foundation of cooperation despite the differences in our values and political systems. The goal was to encourage China to rise peacefully, to become a responsible power as it improved its economic and military capabilities. And I can't tell you how many times I heard the language with which our foreign policy makers talked about our goals for China then become adopted by the Chinese side. Win-win, even the term responsible power. These were things that we put in our speeches that then became adopted by the Chinese side to articulate its own objectives, which, of course, we'd love to hear. And it helped develop cooperation. And in fact, I think you could argue that the United States not only gave China a seat at the table as a regional and global power, but in fact sponsored China's membership in all of these major international agreements and organizations, and was kind of like in a club where you have a current member or even the chairman of the club and brings in the new member arm in arm and gives them an honored seat at the table. That's how the United States treated China. And I had the chance to be a participant in some of these efforts. I'll just give you one quick story as an example of how eager the United States was to have China participate in decision-making at the highest level. After India tested a nuclear weapon, there was, of course, great alarm about proliferation in South Asia on the part of the current nuclear powers. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was in Europe for a G7 meeting, and she called the Chinese Foreign Minister Chiang Kai-shek to discuss how to respond together. And she invited him to come to the G7 meeting because at the time, actually, there was a lot of thought about inviting China to be part of what was then G8 too, because Russia was participating. And, the idea was to a kind of concert of powers, global concert of powers, turn the G7, G8 into that. And so she invited Chiang Kai-shek to come to Europe because she was there with the G7. And he very nicely, well, first of all, it was great he answered the phone, because frequently when American top leaders in the past during crises have called China to try to talk to their counterparts, they can't get someone to answer the phone. That's been a big problem. Chiang Kai-shek answered the phone. He said, well, let me think about that for a minute and get back to you tomorrow, which was perfect. And then he came back and he said, no, we just don't think it would really be appropriate for us to come to the G7 to discuss this issue at the G7. And Secretary Albright just immediately was responsive. He said, okay, let's call a meeting of the permanent 5 of members of the Security Council tomorrow. And that's the way they went. I just give that as an example for the flexibility that the United States was employing to try to find ways to give China the respect it deserves as an emerging global power and to work together on important global issues. China, of course, during this period, signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, basically joined all the global arms control and non-proliferation agreements. And of course, one of the most significant steps was to bring China into the global trade order as a member of the World Trade Organization, which had a very significant impact on China's own economic takeoff. So I would say that engagement with China was, by and large, a great success. It helped reinforce the economic reforms inside China, China's opening to the world economy. As I say, China became a member of almost all of the global governance institutions. Now, of course, some skeptics of engagement in the United States said, well, sure, China's acting nice now because it's weak. But when it gets strong, you can be sure it will show its true self, its true colors. But American foreign policymakers disagreed with that point of view, disagreed with the idea that there's some essential China, that China was characterologically, aggressive, and that China and U.S. interests were in conflict. The premise of engagement was the way we always put it, China's a work in progress. The future of China was indeterminate, and that it could, that we recognized, of course, that the future of China depends on the Chinese people and what their choices are, but that the U.S. could help create a policy environment to encourage China to make the choice to cooperate globally and in its own regional neighborhood. Now, of course, in the U.S. side, our own domestic politics sometimes interfered with this effort. You know, the administration's effort, for example, to increase China's voting shares in the IMF, commensurate with its contributions, took more than 5 years to get Congress to approve it. But by and large, domestic support for engagement was pretty solid. And I might note that particularly important was the support of the business community, that especially large multinational firms were the kind of the key constituency for American engagement with China, because they were very much welcomed the opportunity to invest in China and to manufacture in China and to sell to the very large Chinese market. The one area in which it was difficult to make the case that engagement was really working very well was human rights. In the case of human rights, you know, China signed the UN Human Rights Covenant, but freedom of speech, religion, freedom of the press, civil society organizations, rule of law remained certainly from the American perspective, remained problems because of the Chinese Communist Party's fear of losing control over society. I'm going to tell you very frankly what my own experience in government left me very frustrated, because in all the time that I served in government and have worked from the outside on these issues related to human rights, I see that the United States has very few tools with which to influence China's domestic human rights practices. On the other hand, the growth of market economy itself certainly was and has expanded individual freedom in China. As an old China hand who first went to China during the Cultural Revolution, I've seen this very vividly for myself. And there has been progress, very gradual progress on rule of law, freedom of religion, and of course the commercialization of the media and the growth of the internet have led to greater access to information. So by and large, we could still make the case in the United States that China was moving in a positive direction. Now, on China's side, I don't want to make it sound like the brilliant U.S. policy was responsible for all of this progress, because China itself had to do the heavy lifting. They had to really make the hard choices and change their approach to international relations dramatically from the Mao era, when China was more closed off from other countries, with the exception of the communist bloc and a little bit of third world diplomacy. By and large, this new role for China in international relations really took a lot of learning and a lot of very sophisticated understanding of how China's rise would be perceived by other countries. So The strategy China employed was basically a reassurance strategy. And, I think this was extraordinarily sophisticated and well thought out. And of course, it was Deng Xiaoping who really laid it all out. The goal was to reassure China's neighbors in Asia, the United States, and other countries that China was not a threat. This reassurance strategy was based on a very sophisticated understanding that as China grew more powerful economically, but particularly militarily, that inevitably other countries were going to worry that China would be a threat to them, cause other countries to misperceive it as a threat. So if it wanted to avoid other countries forming a coalition against China, it would have to find a way to credibly demonstrate that its intentions were friendly. The key is intentions, because the improvement of capabilities was obvious, but the uncertainty was, how did China intend to use those capabilities? Now, in the mid-90s, when China started to really step out and play a role in the world, the first thing it did is argue against the so-called China threat theory. There were a lot of rhetoric, a lot of speeches, and saying, oh, we're not a threat, we're not a threat. I remember personally participating in the first conference that China ever had on regional security, Asia-Pacific regional security, back in 1994. And I gave a presentation on the idea of a concert of powers for the Asia-Pacific. And all the Chinese who were there, this was a pretty high-level meeting. Chen Qi-chun was there, and very senior military and diplomatic leaders of China, as well as think tank academic types. Every single one of the Chinese said, oh, no, we're not a power. We can't be a leader. We're not a power. We're just a poor developing country. And they resisted the notion that China was becoming a power or becoming a leader. And that's the period where they just said, oh, no, you're trying to make China sound like a threat. And there was a lot of talk about it. But gradually, Chinese government realized that just saying it was not enough. It wouldn't assure people. You would get misperceptions about China's intentions if you didn't find ways through actions of credibly assuring other countries that China was not a threat. So it did a lot of things that were not easy. It took tremendous restraint and tremendous sophistication. China settled its land border disputes with almost all of its neighbors. And as you can read in Taylor Fravel's excellent book, it settled it through compromises. Oftentimes, China gave up as much or more than it gained in order to improve relations with its neighbors. It offered its neighbors free trade agreements, which was relatively easy to do after China had taken the hard steps to open up its market to join the WTO. It participated actively in the new Asian multilateral institutions as a very important signal of friendly intentions. So this reassurance approach, this good neighbor policy in particular, was very, very effective, very, very successful. And so you had engagement on the U.S. side, reassurance on the Chinese side, and things were going pretty well until about 2009. So what happened then? Well, I think it's a complex story. We don't have time to get into it in detail, but I'll just mention that there are three changes in China's behavior that have particularly concerned the United States and people like me. And I think some of these changes, certainly in China's foreign policy behavior in its own region, stem in part from the global financial crisis in 2008, which was caused by the failures of the American system. Therefore, a kind of the respect for the American system declines in China. There's a misperception in China that the U.S. is on the decline, having lived through a period where in America there was a lot of hand-wringing about the U.S. losing out economically to Japan. Many of us old-timers had more confidence in the resilience of the U.S. system than the American economy, but in China there was a kind of triumphalism that the Chinese system is working. China was the first to recover from the financial crisis. It was less impacted because it's less integrated into the global financial system. Massive stimulus, it recovered fast, which was great for the global economy, but it led to a kind of sense of triumph and a demand for a more assertive, muscular foreign policy on the part of China. So what happened is that the Chinese government began to assert its maritime territorial claims in the South China Sea in a manner that alarmed not just the other claimants, but also Asian neighbors and the United States and Europe to a certain extent as well. Previously, although there had been incipient territorial disputes among the claimants and some flare-ups, there really had been few major incidents to challenge the status quo. And China's reassurance policy meant that it really took a very flexible approach in the South China Sea by and large, and in order to demonstrate friendly intentions, to show it wasn't a bully, and because, in the recognition that if you really wanted to plow your way in and coercively assert your territorial claims over these small rocks in the South China Sea, or to, in fact, the whole waters of the South China Sea, it was a formula for continued bad relations with Southeast Asia. There's no way to assert your selfish claims without it running roughshod over the claims of the other countries, and that's a formula for continued friction with the countries of Southeast Asia. But beginning in about 2009, Chinese government elevated the priority it was giving to these territorial claims ahead of its good relations with its neighbors, and often in ways that don't conform to international legal conventions. Now, from the standpoint of Southeast Asian countries, that represented a direct threat to them. And it kind of caused that all of the good feelings, a lot of the good feelings created by the reassurance good neighbor policy, were eroded. From the standpoint of the United States, although we do have our own interests in the South China Sea, which are mostly related to international law and freedom of navigation. We also, the main thing was it raised questions about what are China's intentions? What kind of rising power is it? Is it a rising power that's trying to reassure other countries, or is it a rising power that's willing to tolerate a very high degree of friction with its neighbors in the pursuit of basically its own self-interest, national interest about territory? So, of course, it's clear that by elevating the importance of these sovereignty claims, the Chinese leadership gets domestic political value out of it. Provoking confrontations with other claimants or U.S. surveillance vessels helps rally the nationalist public around the Communist Party, around the leadership, and helps keep the military loyal. But it definitely has changed perceptions of Chinese intentions, and that's what I want to emphasize. That the perception of Chinese intentions is that China now looks like a risk taker, like a potentially aggressive country. And it has led to a kind of balancing coalition that's sort of right out of the international relations textbooks. You know, Steve Walt at Harvard, his theory is that countries don't balance against strength, they balance against threat. And the threat from China now seems more acute because of its behavior in the South China Sea. China is surrounded by 20 neighbors. This is a very important feature of China's international relations environment. And some of these countries, these 20 countries, are very large and important countries. It's not like the United States with Central America and the Caribbean. It's very different. China's neighbors include countries like Japan, India, Korea, Indonesia, Russia, big, powerful countries. If China can maintain relaxed and friendly relations with its neighbors, this is a big security blanket for China. But if it appears to threaten them, then they're going to join together in a coalition to balance against you. And that's basically what we're seeing in China today. The second thing that has caused great concern in the United States and eroded the domestic foundation for engagement is that there are now significant non-tariff barriers that the Chinese government has erected against international firms to protect their domestic companies and to promote indigenous innovation. China's openness to foreign investment and trade had not only been a critical ingredient in its own economic modernization, but also in fostering constructive relations with the United States and other countries through this interdependence. But over the past decade, China has endangered this good dynamic by exploiting its market power through pressure on foreign firms to transfer their technology as a condition of market entry. And I won't go through the details about this. But as a consequence, many American firms are beginning to doubt the benefits of American engagement with China, and they are calling on the U.S. government to get tougher with China. So this key constituency in American engagement with China is no longer so enthusiastic. about engagement. And by the way, our task force has recently had meetings with Europeans. We went to South Korea, and interesting, we heard the same thing about European firms, even South Korean firms. And when Angela Merkel visited China not that long ago, she started raising questions about the treatment of German European firms in China, and you heard this notion of reciprocity being raised. And I predict that you will start hearing more about the principle of reciprocity in the way that we treat Chinese firms if China is going to treat Western firms and foreign firms in a discriminatory manner. The third problem is about the Communist Party's intensified repression inside China. Today, China appears to be moving away from greater openness and reform. We see tighter controls over the media, the legal profession, non-governmental organizations, academic institutions, and it really, to someone like me, who's been studying China since the bad old days of the Mao era, this looks like a U-turn. And it's very, very discouraging. And I think it's fair to say that that China hands who've been engaged in this effort to improve relations with China and to gradually encourage greater domestic progress in China over many years, this is probably the most disheartening thing of all. And I would like to say that we're cold, objective analysts, but it's not true. There's an emotional dimension to this. Most of us feel passionately because we love China and we hope for the best in China and for the Chinese people. So that when we see this retrogression, we feel very disheartened and discouraged, and I'm sure it colors our ideas about policy as well. So, and by the way, this by inculcating inside China the myth of hostile foreign forces at work in a new ideological Cold War between China and the West, in the idea that the West is actually trying to subvert Chinese government. It's changed the atmosphere in the relations between the two countries and also has a very negative impact of the ability of U.S. and Chinese businesses, universities, media organizations, civil society organizations, and cultural institutions to find common ground and cooperate with one another. So that's a big problem. So I've gone on too long. So how should we react to these new developments? I'd say, and I'll just be very brief here and we can have time for, hopefully, time for discussion, that at the global level, the global governance level, things are going well. And the U.S. efforts to integrate China into global governance institutions, to give China the respect it deserves, should be sustained. No change. Keep doing more of the same. And don't worry about China's expanded global reach in terms of its economic investments, its even building bases and things like this. I don't think in and of themselves they don't present a problem, and they could offer more new opportunities to cooperate with other countries. So it would be wrong for the United States to overreact as if the growth of China's global influence is in and of itself a geopolitical threat. I don't believe that it is. But the biggest problems are in the Asian regional arena. And there the U.S. has to calibrate its response very, very carefully. I have some thoughts about that. I've run out of time. And I guess I want to conclude by saying that it's important for the United States when it reacts to China's actions in the South China Sea or in particular, or in the East China Sea, that the U.S., again, not overreact, and that the U.S. make very clear that its own objectives are not about maintaining U.S. dominance in Asia. That's not the right goal for the United States. The right goal for the United States is a peaceful, stable Asia-Pacific region in which the U.S. continues to play an important role, the U.S. interests are respected. But this is not the playground where kids are trying to say who's number one. That's not important, in my view. And I think there are now misperceptions in China that it's about that. And the U.S. has to react in a strong but moderate way, making very clear that its own intentions, that it are to try to contribute to a peaceful and stable region and not about its own dominance. So we want a strategy that can be a success, not a strategy that guarantees confrontation. So I think that's maybe a good point to finish, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Susan. I see a lot of questions, so maybe we can start with that gentleman.
Let me just say the one kind of question or speech I hope we don't have to endure is a formulaic defense of China's claims in the South China Sea. We've all heard it a million times, so please just let's not do that. Okay? I mean, I'm not going to, this is not the place to do that.
Okay. Mrs. Shirk, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I want to know whether you have any concrete suggestions for the Chinese side, for the Chinese government, and in order to eliminate the mistrust between U.S. and China and to avoid conflicts, or what does the U.S. expected the Chinese government to do in the future in order to improve the relations? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that important question. My own view is that if China could find a way to stabilize relations with the other claimants in the South China Sea and shelve these disputes, as China had been willing to do in the 90s, 2000s, we could get back on track. I think that would be the most important thing. And what that means is take the opportunity of the UNCLOS tribunal ruling, which, regardless of whether or not China legally, formally should accept it or not accept it, from the standpoint of the world, this is now the definition of what international law is. The international court process has spoken. And I'm encouraged by the fact that China's response so far has been quite low-key. I hope this then becomes the kind of foundation for bilateral negotiations with the Philippines, with Vietnam in particular, number one. And the United States should not get in the middle of that at all. Just let those bilateral negotiations stabilize the dispute. Secondly, this is the time for China to really bend over backward on the code of conduct and reassure other countries by taking a very flexible position on code of conduct and having it be a code of conduct with real teeth. No new construction by anybody. Freeze the status quo. Not just informing others, blah, blah, blah. Let's just stop the race. And let's create a good context in which we could get commercial cooperation on energy exploration. Third, China proposes and takes a leadership role in a fishery agreement for the whole region so that we don't have these fishing militia, fishing boats out of control making trouble, and overfishing, which is harming the common good of the fishing business. So let's have a fishing. So I'd say, why not? I think that is absolutely in China's national security interests. And, so I say if that would be the first thing I would do. Relations with Japan are always problematic, more difficult, but also extremely important. In my opinion, the China-Japan relationship is the linchpin of a peaceful, stable region. If China can use its great diplomatic skills to reassure Japan, because right now Japan is preparing for low-intensity conflict with China over the near term. Well then, isn't it in China's national security interest to prevent that by finding ways of reassuring Japan it's not a threat? If they can do that, the United States would be completely comfortable. If Japan is comfortable with China, the U.S. can be comfortable. Many years ago, a very senior Chinese diplomat and I had a private dinner. And he asked me, what kind of role in Asia is the U.S. prepared to have China play? I thought for a minute, and then my answer was, it really depends on the China-Japan relationship. If China and Japan can find a way to get along, then the U.S. is comfortable with having China play whatever kind of role it wants to play as a leader in the region.
Okay, so there's a question from there.
Thank you very much. Massimo Bordignon from the Catholic University of Milan. I have two quick questions. I don't know if you have the time to answer, because I know the question are quick.
How about
the
one?
answer is probably complex.
How about one?
Okay. Okay, I make a more complicated question so that I can put two of them. The first thing is, you describe very, very well what is happening in a very interesting way, but you didn't raise the point, you didn't ask the question, you didn't try to answer why. Why there has been this change in the behavior of the Chinese authority? It's just, there are some political reasons. There is some kind of problem inside, the risk of the Communist Party to lose its power. Is there any substantial reason? Because probably one of the ways also to try to solve this problem is to try to understand which are the substantial issue which is behind this kind of behavior. The second thing that I want just to have your idea about, you talk about the relationship between China and the US, but there is another part which is the relationship between China and the European Union. And a bit the impression that you have is that maybe China is playing the role of divide and conquer in a sense, try in a sense to get some kind of better relationship with the European Union, using it. So, for example, yesterday we heard all this fantastic story, all this win-win strategy about the Obor and whatever, but you have the impression that this might be a way to get even better relation with Germany in particular, and given the leading role of Germany in the European Union, with the European Union. So I want to have your view about it. Thank you.
Well, the first question, I think, I don't feel that I have a completely satisfactory answer. I certainly don't have a parsimonious answer to the first one. I mean, the parsimonious answer in international relations realist theory is what those skeptics had said. When China gets strong, it'll show its true colors. Then China got stronger and it said, okay, we don't have to pretend to be Mr. Nice Guy. Now we can just get what we want, and territory is what we want. I don't really buy that. And I actually spent several years trying to update my book, China, Fragile Superpower, to address this question. And here's how I see it. In the after the global, in the Hu Jintao era. Okay, let me step back. The South China Sea has not been a major focal point of domestic nationalist sentiment in China up until about that time. And so I don't believe it is an issue that was forced on the leadership by domestic nationalism, the need to satisfy domestic nationalism. You have to take a tougher stance. That I do think that is more true on Japan, Taiwan, not South China Sea. If you look at discussions in the media and stuff, there was not that much on South China Sea. What happened in the Hu Jintao era was you had a relatively weak leadership and a collective decision-making structure in which each member of the standing committee had a responsibility assigned to him. And in these different shitong, Tiao shitong, and that there was very little, and that they operated according to a kind of log rolling. So each of them was allowed to do whatever he wanted in his own domain. And you sometimes got a very kind of incoherent policy. Jack Snyder is the international relations scholar who has talked about this kind of log rolling in pre-war Germany and Japan. And I think something with weak restraint from the top. I think something similar was happening in China because you had bureaucracies that aren't even that powerful, like fisheries or Hainan Island or the Coast Guard, using the assertion of these sovereignty rights as a way of getting more resources and power for themselves. So it was a kind of bureaucratic politics log roll that, and then of course when they would assert these sovereignty rights, they'd bring the TV cameras behind them and publicize it more. And that stirred up the nationalist feeling about this issue. So I actually think it's, and then combined with that was the global financial crisis, the change in perceptions about China's power and the demand for a somewhat more muscular foreign policy. But I think that bureaucratic log rolling story is part of the story, but it's pretty complex. And it's not very parsimonious. I think I'll stop there. Europe, of course, it makes sense for China to try to ingratiate itself with Europe. And that's why I think it's interesting that, of course, European countries are glad to have Chinese investment, just like local officials in the United States want Chinese investment. But they also want to make sure that their companies are treated fairly in China. So I think that's why this this effort to use economic ties to improve political ties with Europe isn't going quite as smoothly as China originally hoped it would.
Okay,
I'm sorry
so
to be
thank you. So due to time constraints,
Yeah.
we will take one last question.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
我的中文比英文好啊，所以我愿意用中文来提个问题。
Okay, well, what a 中文太差，所以如果我听不懂，
我这可以翻译，可以翻译。
就是帮助我翻译。
感谢苏珊，Shirk 啊，在当副国务卿的时候啊，对于中美关系所做的贡献。而且您从这个副国务卿位置上进入学界之后啊，一直在关注中美关系啊。刚才你的演讲啊，我觉得很多东西对我们很有启发啊。
Thank you, Susan, for your great contributions during your tenure as a deputy. During your tenure as the Deputy Secretary of State of the U.S., and we are also quite grateful for your efforts after your serving your office in the American diplomacy circle, because you are also keeping focus on the developments in China.
中国政府啊，目前其实有2大关注点啊，在经济上呢，我们是要跨越中等收入陷阱；在国际关系当中呢，我们是要跨越修饰底的陷阱，就防止出现守成大国和崛起大国啊，出现这种竞争的这种局面啊。
As you know, for the time being, China's foreign policy has 2 major concerns. The first one relates to the so-called middle income trap, and second one relates to the so-called Hilfiger's trap.
应该讲，中美关系自从中华人民共和国成立之后，总体上我觉得发展的还比较顺利啊。这个。中国从我们作为学者来讲，我们认为呢，这个刚才另外提到，有的中国学者认为美国的实力在下降啊，我不赞同这看法啊。在相当长时间内，美国仍然是世界上的唯一的超级大国啊。中国很多方面还要向美国学习。至于到这个太平洋问题的南海问题，我想这个太平洋足够大，容得下中美2国啊。中美如果对抗的话，在世界上啊能坏很多事啊；但中美如果合作的话，能干成很多事啊。
Some academics say that the American power is on the decline, but I myself do not think so. In decades to come, America will still remain the sole superpower. And when it comes to the South China Sea, I think that the Pacific Ocean is vast enough to accommodate both China and the USA. And I think if we cooperate, if the US and China cooperate with each other, we can do a lot of positive things. And if we are in conflict, both sides will suffer.
这个南海问题原来也不是很突出啊，在中国实力不是很强，经济实力也不像今天处于世界第2情况下，南海问题原来并不突出。为什么这几年会突出呢？我想这里头与中国自身行为当然也有关系，但我想与美国的行为应该讲也有关系啊。我想小国之所以敢挑战大国，小国敢欺负中国，这个我想也有它的综合因素。我就从中美关系来讲，在这个南海问题上，应该 给南海的相关国家发出清晰的信号，就中美在南海不是对抗关系，而是合作关系，这样可以避免出现小国在安全上靠美国，在经济上也要靠中国这么一个特殊的状态。
So what I'm going to say is that China and the U.S. should not be engaged in a conflict situation in this area, because for the time being, we can see that the weak countries can dare to bully China. That is because they have some big powers backing them up. So if as we have observed in the past decades, the South China Sea issue was not so acute as it is now. So I think there is something for us to think about this situation.
就中美关系不能因为南海像菲律宾这样几个国家小国家在把我们两个大国带入冲突和对抗之中这是我的一个观点是我的观点。
So I think the USA should send a clear signal to China's neighbors in this area. That is to say, we should not allow such small countries as the Philippines or Vietnam to drag U.S. and China into a conflict circle.
当然了，中美如何在太平洋地区相处，我们很愿意和美国智库进行交流给各自国家的这个政府提供很好的这种建议。下面我提个问题是对不起占用大家时间关于这个“一带一路”，因为今天我们主题之一是“一带一路”南海离美国比较远离中国比较近但是“一带一路”，我是回到“一带一路”，因为美国呢也提出了新丝路计划。中国的“一带一路”这个倡议我们涉及的沿线国家有很多呢，也是美国的盟国应该讲“一带一路”倡议要顺利推行，我们必须考虑到美国因素所以从你的角度来讲，我知道奥巴马政府迄今为止没有对“一带一路”做出明确表态但是美国的学界对“一带一路”研究现在也在升温我想听听您的建议您的看法，对于就是说美国官方也好，学者也好对于“一带一路”总体是什么一个观点这个尤其是下头就不要说了不可能就是美国呢，就是新丝路计划和“一带一路”能不能对接就是中美在这方面合作可以做一些大的项目，我觉得你看将来有没有这种可能性
？So think tanks, the Chinese think tanks are quite willing to cooperate, to work with our American counterparts to make contributions to the peaceful development in this area. Now I have one question. As it's well known that the U.S. put forward its new Silk Road policy, and I wonder if there is any probable connection between China's Belt and Road Initiative with the U.S. new Silk Road policy, because when it comes to the Silk Road policy, Silk Road, we have to take into consideration the American factor, because in the Asian Pacific region, there is the American factor that will control or influence its allies in this region. So I want to know America's official or academic position on China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, thank you. I'll just be very brief. I know we're over time. I think some American people in the policy community, some members of Congress, probably view One Belt, One Road just like they view the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank as a reflection of China's ambition to dominate the region or something. I disagree with that point of view. I think we make a mistake if we view everything through this geopolitical competition lens. And, you know, I think China's ambition is totally natural and understandable. What we all hope is that the ambition will be pursued in a way that is legitimate in the eyes of the other countries involved, that they will see benefit, that they will welcome it, and that it will create public goods, not just goods for China. And that it will be open, economically open. My colleague David Lake studies hierarchies in international relations, and he thinks the most important thing is to maintain the economic opportunities for all countries to participate in these initiatives by powerful countries like China. So if it's not an exclusive privilege, but creates public goods, welcomed by other countries, and is open to participation by other countries, then I think it's unobjectionable. Then it's something to be supported, welcomed. The U.S. doesn't have to participate in everything either. That's fine. So that's my personal point of view. But I think it's fair to say that there are people with more primitive thinking about this question. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I hope that maybe over meals and stuff we'll have more chance to talk about these things. Thank you.